Commander Lena Vasquez stepped off the shuttle and onto the docking bay of Orbital Station Verith 9. The air was cold and carried the faint smell of recycled oxygen mixed with something like burnt copper. She adjusted the strap of her gear bag and looked around without saying a word. Behind her, 5 soldiers walked out in a single line. Corporal Deo Okonkwo, a broad-shouldered man with calm, dark eyes. Sergeant Priametta, sharp-faced and quick on her feet. Lance Corporal Finn Carver, the youngest of the group, still wearing the slightly too proud expression of someone on their first big posting. Private Sajin Park, quiet and observant, and Private Alexei Rudin, who had the habit of scanning every room he entered before he allowed himself to relax. None of them spoke, much as they walked, and that was fine with Lena. The station was enormous, one of the largest structures ever built by the Galactic Concorde, and it showed in every direction. Curved metal corridors that stretched far enough to make a human feel small, observation windows the size of buildings, and species from a dozen different worlds walking, floating, and in some cases slithering through the public walkways. The Keth moved in tight clusters with their tentacles folded neatly, the Solari drifted in slow, glowing pairs, and the Vethkai stood at corridor intersections like living columns of armored chitin, their compound eyes tracking everything around them. A Concorde officer met them at the end of the docking corridor. She was a Solari, tall and pale, with the faint shimmer of bioluminescence running along her neck and temples. Her name was Liaison Eva, and she spoke in perfect standard without warmth or hostility, just the careful neutrality of someone doing their job. Commander Vasquez, your squad has been assigned quarters on level 7, and your first briefing is scheduled for the next station cycle. I will escort you to the chamber. Registration office now. Thank you, Lena said, and followed. The registration office processed them quickly, too quickly, Lena thought. The clerk, a Keth with 6 precise arms, handed over their access cards without asking a single question about their qualifications, their service records, or their experience. The cards were color-coded bronze, which Lena later learned was the lowest clearance level on the station, one step above civilian visitor. When she asked Liaison Eva about it, the Solari paused just a fraction of a second before answering. Bronze access is standard for ceremonial security assignments. Lena did not argue. She filed the information away. Their quarters were clean and functional, 6 small rooms along a shared corridor on level 7. Deo claimed the room nearest the exit without making a show of it, which Lena noticed and respected. After they had dropped their gear, she gathered them in the shared space between the rooms, and she kept her voice low and even. We are here as ceremonial guards. That is what the posting says, and that is what everyone on this station believes. But we do our jobs like it means something. Because it does. You watch the room, you watch the people in the room, and you never stop watching. Are we clear? Nobody asked why. They all said yes, and that was enough. The Grand Council chambers were located at the very center of the station, behind 3 checkpoints and 2 sets of reinforced doors. The first time Lena walked through them, she understood why the posting was considered prestigious even in its ceremonial form. The chambers were breathtaking. A wide circular room with a high domed ceiling inlaid with star maps of every known system. Tiered seating arranged in concentric rings for the representatives of 31 species. And at the center, a raised platform where the speaker could stand and be seen and heard by everyone. It was designed to be impressive, and it was. The Real security was handled by others. The Vethkai provided physical protection, their security drones sweeping through the corridors on regular intervals, their officers stationed at every checkpoint. The Solari handled threat assessment, their telepathic sensitivity allowing them to detect hostility in a crowd before any weapon was drawn. It was a system that had worked without failure for over 200 years, and everyone on the station knew it, which was exactly why no one thought twice about placing a small group of humans at the inner door with bronze-level access cards and no scanner equipment. Elder Tharn passed them on the second day. He was the head of the Solara delegation, ancient by any species measure, with deep-set silver eyes and a slow, deliberate way of moving that suggested he had never once been in a hurry. He looked at Lena's squad the way someone looks at furniture they have decided to ignore, polite, distant, and ultimately uninterested. His aide leaned close and said something in the Solara dialect, and Tharn replied in standard, perhaps not realizing or perhaps not caring that Lena could hear him. They are here for decoration, nothing more. Lena heard it. She did not react. Her face stayed exactly as it was, level and attentive, but Deo, standing 2 feet to her right, caught her eye for half a second, and in that half second they had an entire conversation without words, the kind of conversation that only happens between people who have worked together long enough to know what a single look means. That night, after the rest of the squad had gone to sleep, Lena sat in the shared corridor with a printed copy of the chamber layout and a small light. She marked the entry points, the blind spots in the Vethkai drone patrol routes, the positions that offered the best sightlines to all the chamber exits at once. She was not asked to do this. It was not part of her assignment. It was simply what she did. Because standing in a room without understanding it first felt wrong to her in a way. She could not quite explain and had never tried to. 3 weeks passed. The squad fell into routine. Morning briefings, 2 shifts at the inner chamber door, meals in the level 7 common area, and evenings that were quiet enough to feel almost peaceful. The other species on the station were not unkind, just disinterested. A Verith security officer named Hake stopped once to inspect their equipment and made a low sound that everyone present understood to mean polite disappointment. A Keth analyst asked Finn what scanners his rifle was fitted with, and when Finn said it was not fitted with any, the Keth stared at him for a long moment and then walked away without another word. But Lena watched, and Deo watched, and Priya watched, and all 6 of them, in their own quiet ways, learned the station, its rhythms, its people, its small daily patterns and its tiny irregularities. They learned which delegates arrived early and which arrived late, which aides stood too close to their superiors and which stood too far, which maintenance workers used the east corridor and which ones never did. They were not asked to learn these things. They learned them anyway. The session that changed everything was scheduled for the 14th day of the 3rd station cycle, a closed vote on the Verith Resource Rights Treaty, which would determine which species had legal mining access to 14 uninhabited systems along the Outer Rim. It was the kind of vote that made powerful people nervous, because the numbers were close and the stakes were enormous, and everyone in the chamber knew that the wrong outcome would make enemies of someone important. Security was tighter than usual. Hake had doubled the drone sweeps through the outer corridors, and the Solari had positioned 2 additional telepaths at the main entrance checkpoint. The Keth had sent their own data security team to monitor all communication signals entering and leaving the station. In short, the whole apparatus of Concord security was running at full capacity, and there was a quiet confidence among the senior officers that nothing could get through. Lena's squad took their posts at the inner door as usual, Deo on the left side, Priya on the right, Finn and Sejin further down the corridor, Alexei at the junction point. Lena stood at the center, close enough to the door to see everyone who passed through it. The delegates arrived in their usual order, the Keth first, precise and punctual, the Verith next, heavy-footed and already talking amongst themselves, the Solari last, moving in that unhurried way they always did, and behind the main Solari delegation came the aides, 12 of them, each carrying data slates and wearing the pale grey robes of the diplomatic corps. They moved through the checkpoint, were scanned, were cleared, and filed into the chamber one by one. Deo watched them come through. It was the same thing he did every session, and usually it was nothing. Faces passed, he noted them and moved on, but one face made him stop inside his own head, even though his body did not move at all. The aide was dressed correctly, pale grey robe, Solari diplomatic credentials on a lanyard, data slate tucked under the left arm. The Solari checkpoint scanner had passed him green, and the Verith drone had logged him as cleared. There was nothing wrong with any of it, except that the aide was sweating. Solari did not sweat. Their biology ran cool, their skin stayed dry even in warm environments. Deo had spent 3 weeks watching Solari delegates come and go through a chamber that humans found slightly too warm, and not one of them had ever shown a single bead of moisture on their skin. But this aide had a faint shine along the side of his neck, just below the ear, and his left hand, the one not holding the data slate, was trembling, barely, in a rhythm that Deo recognized from somewhere he could not immediately name. He named it 3 seconds later, a criminology elective at the University of Lagos, a semester he had almost dropped because the lectures were dry and the reading was heavy, and a professor who had made the class watch hours of footage of people write before they did something violent, the microtremor in the non-dominant hand, the controlled breathing that was just slightly too controlled, the eyes moving not randomly but in a specific sequence. Door, target, exit, door, target, exit. Deo did not raise his rifle. He did not shout. He did not even look at Lena first. He simply stepped forward, placed himself directly in the path of the aide, and said in a calm and even voice, "Sir, I need you to step to the side with me for a moment." The aide froze for exactly 1 second, and in that 1 second, Deo saw everything confirm itself. The freeze was not the freeze of an innocent person who was confused. It was the freeze of someone running calculations, and then the aide moved, fast and sharp, reaching into the fold of his robe. Deo was already moving. He caught the wrist before the hand came free, turned the body hard into the wall, and had the aide face down on the floor in under 2 seconds. The data slate clattered away, the lanyard snapped, and from inside the robe fell a small flat device, no larger than a palm, that the Verith security team would later identify as a resonance disruptor capable of killing every living thing in the chamber within 30 seconds of activation. The corridor erupted. Vethkai officers came running from both ends, Solari telepaths poured out of the checkpoint room, alarms began sounding in multiple registers. Priya had her rifle up and the corridor locked down before anyone gave the order. Finn had moved to cover the chamber door, and Alexei had already keyed the evacuation signal for the delegate area. It took less than 15 seconds for the full security response to arrive. It had taken Deo 9 seconds to make it unnecessary. He stood over the subdued figure with his breathing steady and held the position until two Vethkai officers physically lifted the aide off the floor and took him away. Only then did Deo step back, straighten his uniform, and return to his post. He did not say anything. He did not look proud or relieved or shaken. He just stood there, the way he had been standing before, watching the corridor. Elder Tharn came out of the chamber with the rest of the delegation when the evacuation signal sounded. He stood in the corridor and looked at the Vethkai officers processing the scene, at the device now sealed inside a containment bag, at the checkpoint team running urgent diagnostics on their scanners trying to understand how they had missed it, and then he looked at Deo. Deo was not looking back at him. Deo was looking at the rest of the corridor, watching the faces of the people still moving through the evacuation, doing the same steady thing he had been doing when he first spotted the assassin. Tharn stood very still for a long moment. In all his centuries of service to the Concord, he had never felt the particular kind of unease that comes from realizing you almost missed something catastrophic. He had trusted the scanners, trusted the telepaths, trusted the system that had worked for 200 years, and the system had failed, quietly and completely. And a human corporal with no scanner and no telepathy had caught what 200 years of technology had not. He did not say anything to Deo. There was nothing ready to say yet. He let his aides guide him toward the secure lounge and he went, but he looked back at the corridor once, and then a second time, before the door closed behind him. In the chamber, the vote on the Resource Rights Treaty was postponed for 48 hours pending a full security review. Nobody argued with that decision. The emergency security review was held in the Concord's secondary conference chamber, a smaller and far less impressive room than the grand chambers. The seating was functional rather than ceremonial, and the representatives present were not the senior delegates but their security liaisons and senior analysts. It was a room for people who dealt with problems, not people who made speeches. Harkay of the Vethkai opened the session. He was a large officer even by Vethkai standards, and he clearly did not enjoy the position he now found himself in, sitting at a table, explaining how his drones had passed a disguised assassin through a checkpoint. He presented the technical data without embellishment. The resonance disruptor had been shielded with a synthetic biological casing designed to mimic the density and heat signature of a standard data slate. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering, and he said so, not as an excuse but as a fact. The Solari representative at the table, a younger telepath named Sarel, explained the failure on her side with similar precision. The assassin had been given a neural suppression compound that flattened the emotional output that Solara telepaths read as threat indicators. From a telepathic scan, he had registered as calm, slightly bored, and entirely unremarkable. There had been nothing to detect. Both explanations were reasonable, both were true, and together they describe a security system that had been specifically designed around and against the station's existing defenses. Someone had studied Verith 9's protocols carefully and built a bypass for every single layer. Except one. Chief Analyst Ryan of the Keth Collective had spent the 48 hours since the incident doing what the Keth did best, going through data, all of it, every sensor log, every access record, every camera feed from the last 14 months. Ryan had 4 arms, each capable of operating an independent data terminal, and the Keth had a cultural tradition of not sleeping when there was a problem left unsolved. By the time the review session began, Ryan had been working for 31 consecutive hours and showed no signs of stopping. When it was Ryan's turn to speak, the room became very quiet. The Keth had a reputation for finding things, and the look on Ryan's face suggested that something significant had been found. Ryan placed 9 incident files on the central display, 9 separate events from the previous 14 months, each flagged in the original records as minor, handled, and closed. A delegate who had entered a restricted corridor and been quietly redirected before reaching a sensitive area. A package left unattended near the chamber entrance that had been removed without incident. A maintenance worker whose access card had logged a suspicious pattern. 6 other small events that had been noted. And then forgotten. None of them had ever been escalated. None had resulted in injury or breach, and none of them had drawn any particular attention at the time. Every single one of them had been handled by a human guard. Ryan let that information sit in the room for a moment before continuing. Then the Keth analyst pulled up the specific response records, who had acted, what they had done, and how long it had taken. In every case, the response had been immediate and physical. No scanner alert had triggered. No telepath had flagged a concern. No drone had issued a notification. In every case, a human had simply moved. as if they had already known something was wrong before any system in the building had registered a problem. This is not coincidence, Ryan said, and the Keth did not use that phrase lightly, because coincidence was a concept the Keth had essentially removed from their analytical vocabulary. These are 9 data points describing a consistent and repeatable capability. The humans are detecting pre-threat behavioral signals that our systems are not designed to read. The Vethkai liaison said that this seemed like a generous interpretation of what might simply be good instinct. Ryan replied that instinct was a word that species used when they did not yet understand the mechanism, and that the mechanism here was worth understanding. The Solari representative Sarel was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked the question that no one else had yet asked directly: what exactly are they reading? That was when Commander Vasquez was invited into the room. Lena had been waiting in the corridor outside. She had been told the review might require her input, and she had spent the waiting time the way she spent most waiting time, watching the people who walked past. She came in, sat down, and looked at the table of senior analysts and security officers with the same level expression she wore on duty. Ryan asked her to explain, in simple terms, what Corporal Okonkwo had seen in the corridor that the scanners and the telepaths had not. Lena thought about how to answer, not because she did not know, but because she was trying to find words that would travel cleanly across species. He saw someone who was about to do something. The body gives signals before the decision becomes an action. Heart rate, muscle tension, eye movement, small changes in how a person holds themselves. It is not something you think through, you just see it. Most humans see it, if they have been trained to look. And some see it even without training. Ryan asked how this capability had developed. The same way everything about us developed, Lena said. We needed it to survive. Not survive predators, but survive each other. Humans have been lying to each other, manipulating each other, and trying to read each other's intentions for as long as we have existed. The ones who could not read the room did not last long enough to pass anything on. The room was very quiet after that. Ryan recorded the statement, tagged it as significant, and added a formal note to the incident file that would later become the basis for a recommendation to the full council. Human personnel demonstrated a pattern recognition capability in live social environments that was not replicated by any current sensor technology and should be considered a unique and non-redundant security asset. The recommendation was filed before the end of the session. The vote on whether to act on it would come later, but in that room, in that moment, something had already shifted. The way people looked at the idea of a human standing guard had changed, quietly and completely, the same way the humans themselves had handled those 9 prior incidents, without ceremony, without announcement, and without anyone fully realizing it was happening until it was already done. The station went back to its regular rhythms after the review. The Resource Rights Treaty vote was rescheduled, security protocols were updated, and the captured assassin was transferred to a Concord detention facility for processing. Life on Verith 9 continued the way life on large stations tends to continue, busily, with most people focused on the work directly in front of them and very few thinking too hard about what had almost happened. But Elder Tharn was thinking about it. He found Lena on level 7, in the shared corridor outside the squad quarters. During the late station cycle when the rest of her team was off duty, she was sitting with a small light and a printed sector map, marking something in the margins with a stylus. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and did not seem surprised to see him, which he noticed. "Commander Vasquez," he said, "I would like to speak with you, if you are willing, not officially, not for any record or report, simply as one person to another." Lena set down the stylus and gestured to the seat across from her. Tharn sat. It was a human-designed chair, slightly too small for the long frame of a Solari, but he settled into it without complaint. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I said something when your squad first arrived. I believe you heard it. I called you decoration." "I heard it," Lena said. "I was wrong," Tharn said. He said it cleanly and without a long preamble, the way very old people sometimes speak when they have decided there is no longer any point in softening something that is simply true. "I would like to understand why I was wrong, not the tactical explanation, which analyst Ryan has already provided in considerable detail, but the deeper reason. I am very old, Commander, and I have seen many species rise and take their place in the Concord, and I do not think I have ever encountered a species quite like yours. I would like to understand what you are." Lena was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but choosing her words carefully. "How much history do you know?" "About Earth." "Less than I should," Tharn said. "We have been at war with each other for most of our existence," Lena said. "Not with other species, with ourselves. For tens of thousands of years, the greatest threat to a human being was another human being. We lied to each other, stole from each other, built alliances and broke them, made promises we intended to keep and promises we never intended to keep, and learned every way there is to gain a person's trust and then use it against them. She paused, not for effect, but because she was thinking about how to say the next part correctly. Every human alive today is a descendant of people who survived all of that, not just the wars, but the politics, the betrayals, the slow social dangers that do not come with weapons drawn, the ones who could read a room, who could tell when a smile was real and when it was not, who could feel the change in a space before they could name what had changed. Those are the ones who made it, and they passed that ability down to us. Tharn listened without interrupting. The Solari were naturally good listeners, it was part of who they were, but this was a different kind of listening, the kind that happens when something is being said that the listener has genuinely never heard before. So when Corporal Orconquo spotted the assassin, Tharn said slowly, "He was doing something that your species has been doing for thousands of years." "He was doing what every human in a room full of people does," Lena said, "running a constant check. Who is comfortable, who is nervous, who is hiding something, who is about to move. Most of the time it is background noise. We do not even notice we're doing it, but when something is wrong, the signal goes off, and it is very hard to ignore." The Solari developed telepathy because we lived in close communities where cooperation was essential, Tharn said. He was not arguing, he was thinking out loud. Our ability came from a life of trust. Yours came from the opposite. Yes, Lena said. Your species never had the luxury of trust, Tharn said. It was not quite a question. Lena looked at the map on the table for a moment, and then she looked at the observation window at the end of the corridor, where the stars were cold and still and very far away. No, she said, but we learn how to earn it, and we learn how to recognize it when it was real, because we had seen so much of the false kind that the difference became impossible to miss. Tharn was quiet for a long time, long enough that the station's air system cycled once and the light above them flickered briefly in the way that the level 7 lights always flickered at that hour. "I owe your squad an apology," he said finally. "You do not need to apologize to us," Lena said. "We are used to being underestimated. It does not affect us the way it might affect other species. If anything, it is useful." Tharn tilted his head slightly. "How so?" "People who think you a decoration do not watch you," Lena said. "And people who do not watch you do not adjust their behavior around you, which means you see them as they actually are, not as they want to be seen." Tharn sat with that for another long moment, and then he made a sound that Lena had not heard from a Solari before, a low, soft sound somewhere between acknowledgement and something almost like laughter. "You are a very unusual species," he said. "We get that a lot," Lena said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was close enough to be understood across species lines. Tharn stood, straightened his robes, and looked at her one final time. "I will be supporting the formal recommendation," he said. "I want you to know that." "Thank you, Elder," Lena said. He walked back down the corridor and she watched him go, the way she watched everyone go, noting his pace, the set of his shoulders, the small details that told her everything about a person's state of mind even when that person was trying hard to show nothing. And what she saw in the way Elder Tharn walked away was a man who had been changed by a conversation, quietly and completely, and who was only just beginning to understand how deeply. She picked up the stylus and went back to the map. The formal session that would decide the matter was scheduled for the first day of the new station cycle, 6 months after the incident in the corridor, and in those 6 months, a great deal had changed on Verith 9, though most of the changes were the kind that do not announce themselves loudly. The squad's access cards had been quietly upgraded from bronze to gold, the highest clearance level on the station, and nobody made a ceremony of it, which was exactly how Lena had preferred it when she was asked for her preference on the matter. The Vethkai security chief had requested a formal meeting with her and spent 2 full hours asking her to walk through the chamber with him and identify what she would change about the patrol patterns. She had done so, and the patterns had been changed. The Keth analyst team had requested individual interviews with each member of the squad and produced a 90-page document on what they called intuitive threat detection in social environments, which was distributed to the Concord's Security Advisory Board and apparently caused significant debate among people who had spent their professional lives believing that good enough technology could replace every biological capability. Deo had been given a formal commendation, a Concord citation in 6 languages, presented by a Vethkai general in the secondary conference chamber. He had accepted it, shaken the general's hand or the Vethkai equivalent of a hand, and then gone directly back to his post, which everyone who witnessed it found either deeply admirable or slightly strange, depending on which species they belonged to. But the real change was in how people looked at the squad. It was subtle at first. The Vethkai checkpoint officers began greeting them by name rather than nodding past them. The Solora telepath started stopping occasionally to share information about which delegates in the day's lineup were carrying unusual stress or tension, the way you share useful information with someone you now consider a colleague. Even the Keth analysts in the corridors, who had previously walked past the human guards as if they were part of the station furniture, began making eye contact and sometimes stopping to ask questions, curious in the way the Keth were always curious when they had found something they did not yet fully understand. The session itself was packed. All 31 Concord member species had sent their senior representatives, and the galleries were full. The agenda had been circulated in advance, and every species with access to Concord communications knew what was being voted on, which meant that the chamber was being watched that day by something close to 2 trillion people across the known galaxy, via broadcast feeds and diplomatic relay networks. The item was listed formally as proposed Decree 7 of the Verith Accords. In plain language it read, "Human personnel shall serve as the primary security detail for all Grand Council chamber sessions, effective immediately and in perpetuity, unless revoked by unanimous vote of the full membership." The debate before the vote lasted just under 2 hours. Several representatives spoke in favor, citing analyst Ryan's report, the full incident file, and the broader record that Ryan's data team had assembled showing that human behavioral detection was a consistent and unique capability with no technological equivalent. 2 representatives raised procedural concerns about the precedent of assigning a single species to such a permanent role. One representative, from a species whose name, translated roughly as the careful ones, asked whether there was any evidence that the human capability could be trained into members of other species. Ryan answered that last question with 4 words, "Not in any meaningful time frame," and sat down. The vote was called. 31 species, 31 votes, and when the tally was read aloud by the session chair, a Keth Council member who delivered the result in the same tone she would have used to announce a schedule change, the number was the same for both columns, 31 in favor, 0 against. Unanimous. Lena stood at her post at the inner chamber door and heard the result read aloud and did not move. Her face was exactly as it always was on duty, level, attentive, and watching the room. Deo, 2 feet to her right, caught her eye and gave the smallest nod that could still be counted as a nod. She returned it, and that was the entire celebration. Behind the scenes, there were formal handshakes and communications and a dinner held in the station's main reception hall that the squad attended for exactly 45 minutes before Lena quietly pulled them out on the grounds that someone needed to be watching the corridors, which was technically true and which everyone present understood was also Lena being exactly who Lena had always been. The real moment, the moment that none of them talked about afterward but all of them carried, happened the following morning, when the new security assignments were posted on the station's official board and the squad's names appeared at the top of the list for Grand Council chamber duty, not labeled as ceremonial, not labeled as supplementary, just listed plainly, Primary Security Detail, Grand Council Chambers, Commander L. Vasquez and assigned personnel. Finn saw it first and called the others over. They stood in front of the board in the early quiet of the station, before the day's foot traffic had started, and looked at their names listed there in plain text. Alexei said something low and quiet in Russian that no one else fully caught, but the tone of it was clear. Sejin was smiling, the first wide, unguarded smile any of them had seen from her in 6 months. Priya read it twice, the way she read everything important, and Deo looked at it for a long moment and then looked away, back toward the corridor that led to the chambers, and his expression was the same expression he wore at his post, focused, alert, and completely at home. In the work. They walked to the chambers together and took their positions. Deo stood at his station and let his eyes move slowly and steadily across the room, a Keth analyst arriving early and setting up a terminal, a Vethkai aide carrying a stack of data tablets and struggling slightly with the balance, 2 Solori representatives speaking quietly near the far entrance, a young delegate from a species Deo was still learning the full name of, who kept glancing at the main door the way people glance at doors when they are waiting for someone important to arrive. He watched, not with suspicion, not with hostility, but with the full and steady attention of someone who understood completely that this was what he was for, this quiet, constant reading of the room, this ancient and deeply human habit of knowing who was in the space around you, what they were feeling, and what they were about to do. It was not glamorous work, it did not look impressive from the outside, and nobody watching him stand there could have said exactly what he was doing or why it mattered. But in 31 systems, in the chambers of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, it was now officially and unanimously agreed that it mattered enormously, and that of all the species in the Concord, only one had ever really known how to do it. The session began, the chamber filled, and Corporal Deo Okonkwo watched the room the way he always did, the way his people always had, going back further than anyone in that chamber could fully imagine, careful, quiet, and completely awake to every living thing around him.